Is China's increasingly bad economy forcing it to lash out against the rest of the world? Historically speaking, that's what happens. When things don't go so well at home, you don't just export your excess production, you also stir things up internationally. And the latest data we just got from China shows it's not going so well at home, and also that it's lashing out against especially its neighbors. On top of the most recent ugly statistics, now we're getting news China's central bank is taking aim at the bond market. There are widespread reports today the PBOC is going to be selling treasury bonds. No, not US treasury bonds, Chinese treasury bonds. Why sell Chinese government bonds? Because the Chinese government has been trying to fight negative perceptions, but they keep losing the battle because it's not just perception. As China continues to lose ground on the economic front, there are also numerous reports the country is becoming more aggressive geopolitically. Again, that's always been the historical danger. Things go bad at home, lash out abroad. China's economic and financial problems aren't just about China, though, and their consequences aren't going to be limited to China. The more the Chinese do, the more you know it isn't going well. Now, at the end of last month, the outgoing head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a fellow by the name of Admiral John Aquilino, had some very pointed and timely comments. We all need to understand that it's moving very fast, the Admiral said. The buildup of military power despite a bad economy, the increased narrative of all things inside the 10-dash line, which we'll get to in a second, are Chinese sovereign territory, then the actions that are going toward enforcement. But is it despite a bad economy? Again, historically speaking, when the economy gets bad, you start making trouble around the neighborhood and wherever else you can. And that's been the case throughout history in any number of examples, including recent times. Russia. Aquilino, who is preparing to step down after serving 3 years in the regional role overseeing 380,000 personnel, said China's actions in the South China Sea were dangerous and destabilizing. Tensions have grown around the Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines maintains a grounded World War II era ship, and Chinese vessels have used water cannons to block Philippine military missions that rotate and resupply troops on the vessel. So there's all sorts of competing claims, and we don't need to get into those claims here because they are incredibly complicated, and we're not going to settle the matter either. But essentially, the Chinese have been trying to claim increasing territory. They've released, I think, a couple series of claims. What they say is based on historical evidence as well as international law. There was the 9-dash line, and now there's a 10-dash line, as the Admiral was referring to. But basically, the Chinese want to claim the entire South China Sea, and they're taking steps to try to do so, often at the expense of their neighbors like the Philippines and Vietnam, and of course, Taiwan. But just today, whereas as it relates to the Philippines, President Marcos was at a meeting and he basically singled out the Chinese defense minister to his face. According to news reports, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. asserted his nation's claim in the disputed South China Sea while taking pointed swipes at Beijing during a speech at Asia's top security forum as China's new defense minister sat in the audience. With the Philippines and China locked in a standoff over disputed islands and reefs, Marcos used his speech Friday night at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore to call out, quote, assertive actions that aim to propagate excessive and baseless claims through force, intimidation, and deception. And he also said they're going to continue constructive avenues, dialogue, conversation, working through partners, all of that stuff. But the lines are being drawn where if the Philippines under the former president were moving closer to China, now moving closer to the United States again, as well as other types of what the Chinese call small-scale cliques, China, the Philippines, and Japan being a new one. Essentially, the world is beginning to divide along hardened lines. It's more us versus them. And so much of this is not just about long-standing geopolitics. It all goes back to the Eurodollar system. That breakdown in 2007 left us without the same type of environment that we had gotten used to. The idea that the world was going to become more cooperative, more integrated. Everyone was going to be a brotherhood centered upon rising wealth and opportunity. But that got shattered. And over the last decade and a half, it's become more people are realizing that dream is gone. And now we have to make do with a shrinking pie, or a pie that isn't growing anywhere close to as much or as fast as the world needs. And so it leads to all sorts of fractures and problems, including this sort of deglobalization that spins off into geopolitics, as well as all the financial and economic stuff that we normally deal with. So the more the economic situation worsens in China as well as the rest of the world, because these two things are related. China's problems are not just about China. They're also about the global trade recession and the global recession in general that has already hit many places and may be hitting more this year, in spite of all the promise of reflation. And part of reflation is premised on the Chinese economy getting out of its own way and actually recovering. But we keep getting more and more signs that that's not going to happen. It's less likely. And it just leads to the self-reinforcing vicious cycle. We've got a trade recession around the rest of the world, becomes a Chinese problem. The Chinese have their own problems, which add more to the trade recession. And on we go. Except now we have heightened geopolitical tensions to also throw into the mix. With all that as a backdrop, the Chinese central bank has been trying desperately to get a hold of the situation, whether it be the currency, the real estate situation, doesn't matter. Now they have one more problem on their hands, which is the Chinese bond market. Now, earlier this year, some of Xi Jinping's old speeches, including one from last October, resurfaced. In this one in last October, Xi had talked about how the Chinese central bank needs to act more like its Western counterparts, and maybe it should start entering trades in the bond market in order to manage liquidity like the Federal Reserve or ECB, as if that would be an actual good thing. But again, when you're desperate and things aren't going well, you maybe even give the Fed's model a try. I don't know. But anyway, that's what the speech said, that maybe the PBOC would start considering and using the bond market as a way to manage liquidity. So, of course, immediately everybody went running to, oh my God, the Chinese are going to do QE. Here's Bloomberg from April when the speech resurfaced. The vague comments from the Chinese leader led some traders to initially argue that Beijing may be considering quantitative easing, an unconventional form of stimulus that involves purchasing sovereign bonds. It's not so unconventional anymore. Everybody's been doing it for decades. And other assets to push down yields and boost economic activity. First adopted by the Bank of Japan more than 2 decades ago because it doesn't work, the tactic was later used by the Fed, who was just desperate, and other policymakers after the global financial crisis, which was not a financial crisis, and the coronavirus pandemic. So everybody thought, okay, the PBOC is going to start buying bonds. They've talked about, the National People's Congress talked about lowering interest rates. PBOC officials have talked about lowering interest rates. So why not, if Xi Jinping is saying use the bond market to manage liquidity like Western central banks, this must mean another aggressive stimulus tactic in the form of China QE. But then today, the PBOC didn't actually come out and explicitly say so, but they did explicitly say we're not buying bonds. The central bank won't buy treasury bonds at the moment, the PBOC affiliated newspaper said, citing an unnamed source as saying that falling yields mean it's not a good time to buy. Bond yields move inversely to prices. However, if large amounts of bank deposits flow into the bond market and the demand for risk-free assets keeps rising, then the PBOC will consider selling treasury bonds, the article said. That could come as a surprise to some who had expected the central bank to buy up bonds instead. So what they're saying is no QE, we're not going to be buying bonds. Bonds are way overvalued. We're more likely to sell them, which of course raises a bunch of questions, including why would they want to sell treasury bonds? Not U.S. treasury bonds. That's not what they're doing here. Chinese treasury bonds. Now, the PBOC doesn't have a massive amount of Chinese treasury bonds because they've never done a QE before, but they do have roughly about 200 billion. I think it's 175 to 200 billion, somewhere in that range. Why would they be selling treasury bonds? Well, as the article said, the heightened demand for risk-free assets, safety and liquidity. That runs contrary to what the PBOC is trying to accomplish. They're trying to accomplish rescuing the financial system, which is going to require a high degree of risk-taking, not a whole bunch of very public deflationary signals. Heightened demand for safe assets, flight to safety. Those are not the kinds of signals that Chinese authorities want the marketplace to send to the rest of the marketplace or the world. They don't want interest rates to continue to fall so that we keep talking about lower and lower interest rates, because in the market context, unlike the media context, they're aware of what low interest rates actually signal. Lower bond yields, safety and liquidity demand, not good signs. You see bond rates falling down, you're less likely to jump into real estate investment opportunities that the government would like you to, or to fund any number of these developers like the government would want you to. Better to try, at least according to their calculus, since nothing else is working, better to try manipulating interest rates, getting them to stop falling, than to just have interest rates continue to go down and the marketplace understand what that signal actually means. Nothing good, I can tell you that. This is not the first statement the PBOC has made, or the first hint the PBOC has given that they don't like what interest rates are doing. And it's as a result, China's bond rally has paused a little bit here at the longer end. The 10-year Treasury yield has been mostly sideways over the last several weeks. The 5-year the same, though the 2-year continues to go down, which of course is attributed to expectations of rate cuts, but really it's just the same thing. So the Chinese are stepping up their rhetoric to kind of get interest rates to go at least sideways and stabilize rather than to continue to fall, which sounds a lot like their efforts in the currency markets as well, because it all keeps coming back to the same thing. It's not just about speculators or perceptions. The reality on the ground in China is not good. And speaking of reality not being good, last night, the Chinese government reported its PMIs for the month of May, and they were ugly. Way less than expectations, as well as continuing to show there is no traction from all of this quote-unquote stimulus. The recovery is not happening. There won't be a Chinese contribution to reflation. The manufacturing PMI, which was the big one, dropped all the way to 49.5. So only 2 months above 50, which were really associated with the Golden Week. A little bit was probably about running production to dump the excess on the global markets, but really we're back below 50 again in China. The expectation was that the PMI would rise 1/10 of a point to 50.5. So it missed by an entire point and was back below 50 into contraction. New orders fell into contraction, of course, and of foreign sales, export orders, down to 48.3 from above 50 in April. So global trade recession, that little mini renaissance in the inventory cycle that we experienced or saw in some places to start this year, that seems to be dissipating rather quickly. And here the Chinese are saying, yeah, thanks for that. A reborn global trade recession at the worst possible time. So again, this is not just about China being China. There is a international component that is causing a lot of distress on top of the internal distress. And the internal distress, we see that in the non-manufacturing PMI, which unexpectedly, quote unquote, fell to 51.1, was down just 1/10 from the April level, but still 51.1 is among the lowest in the entire series. So again, no evidence that the stimulus is having any effect. The Golden Week spike, that's a distant, or the Golden Week monthly spike, that's a distant memory. Orders in China on the non-manufacturing side continue to be weak, less than 50. Foreign orders were weaker, down at 47.6. And really the big one in all of these PMIs, here we have the non-manufacturing PMI employment index falling all the way to 45.2. It is ugly all the way around, which is why there's a bond rally to begin with, and also why the PBOC would have a major interest in trying to stop the rally, as one way to stop the market from signaling this reality. I want to end here on foreign direct investment because it is the combination of bad economy and increasingly hostile and aggressive politics, including policies that are being put in place by an increasingly aggressive and hostile Chinese government. Foreign direct investment has continued to decline, And the latest data from the Ministry of Commerce, it just gets uglier and uglier. The accumulated rate is the lowest on record for a period up until April. And we're talking like 2009 type of figures. Now, the statistics from the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which are a little bit different than what the Ministry of Commerce puts out, those showed in 2023 the lowest net basis in 30 years. Net foreign direct investment into China, which is comparing the amount of foreign investment coming in versus the amount of foreign investment going out. Net foreign investment was a positive, but only 33 billion in the year of 2023. That compared to 180 billion in 2022 and 344 billion in 2021. So net FDI is down 90% in 2 years. And you can understand why that is. Here's Nikkei describing the statistics. Foreign companies have been scaling down their Chinese operations after the Chinese government focused more on protecting national security, including a crackdown on spying. Authorities tightened their grip on research companies conducting market analysis and other activities, and there have been reports of workers of foreign companies being detained. Again, a more hostile environment. You go back 15 years to the Eurodollar era, actually more than 15 years now, 17 years and more, to the Eurodollar era. The Chinese government was opening. They were welcoming. They said, hey, come on over. We'll do whatever we can to help you because you're going to help us grow our economy because this is what the socialist dream is all about. Nowadays, it's becoming more and more the opposite. Hostility, aggressiveness, suspicion, even of just, economic activities that normally would have been ignored or at least welcomed, would have been invited. But it's not just about the politics. Again, it's a combination politics and bad economy. Going back to Nikkei, the prolonged slowdown in Chinese economic growth is another reason foreign companies are refraining from investing. Domestic demand is weak due in part to the real estate market slump, and there are warning signs for deflation. They're not warning signs, that's actually been happening. So, bad economy, hostile government, and all of these things together lead to this type of a global economic environment, type of global situation that spills over beyond just the economic environment. We've got financial problems, instability in currency markets. It's just one big, huge mess. China is acting more aggressively. At the same time, its economy gets worse and worse and worse. We've got more and more data on the latter, and we should not be surprised at the former. Those two are connected. It's not one in spite of the other. It's the one because of the other. On top of the data showing the Chinese economy still isn't responding and the constantly claimed recovery still isn't gaining traction, the global economy is not helping. And you see that in Chinese statistics as well as domestic statistics and everywhere else around the world. The long claimed and planned for reflation in 2024 just isn't happening. And China is disappointing, as well as China reflecting a bunch of global disappointment. So that plus the real estate sector and the real estate rescue in China, which is running into troubles already, no wonder the Chinese central bank is acting like it needs to intervene in the bond market to at least eliminate one of these very troubling signals. They keep getting forced into doing more and more and more, not just rescuing the real estate sector or the economy. Now they got to tamp down on signals that show that neither of those things are working. They keep getting pulled into doing more and more. And as we keep saying, the more the Chinese feel they have to do, the worse it is. Not just the economy, but also in geopolitics and maybe more than that. China has been dumping everything, it seemed. Dumping excess production, dumping U.S. treasuries. I talked about the latter of those, dumping U.S. treasuries, in the video link below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. Until next time, take care.